So as you can see, we have upgraded Lance Egan once again. Someone did ask. They're like, is Lance still going to be
he
doing
okay?
these? Is Lance okay? Well, guess what?
Lance is great.
We
He's
don't know.
downstairs right now.
No.
Oh.
We weren't supposed to. We don't know where Lance. How Lance. Anyway, Joe Goodspeed is here with us. If you don't know Joe, he likes long walks on the beach looking for tuna, and that's all I know really. So anyway, tell us about yourself, Joe.
Thanks, Cheech. You guys looking for the personal background or the, the professional background?
Like, I want you to go through just like, I know that you were a college athlete. I can see that competitive nature with the way you describe rods even.
You can. I'm often asked that question of, are you an engineer, or what is your college background? And it's English literature.
Yes.
At SUNY Geneseo. And when I was going to college, I had two goals. When I was leaving high school and going to college, the one goal was like I wanted to be a pretty much professional athlete. I wanted to be an Olympic level high jumper.
Okay.
And the other goal was I wanted to expend as little energy as I could going through college.
Wait, okay, now tell us how that works.
Well, you see the movie Forrest Gump?
Yeah.
He describes the time where he's playing football at Alabama.
Yeah.
He describes it as, after like 4 years of football at Alabama, I graduated with a degree in something or other. And that was like my time at Geneseo. After 4 years of high jumping, I graduated with the degree in English literature, and I carried in enough credits from high school, from the AP classes, and was so strategic in scheduling my classes to only take credits and no more credits than I needed to graduate, that I graduated in 4 years with precisely the number of credits necessary to graduate without one single superfluous extra credit. And I never took more than 14 credit hours in any one semester in college and was able to graduate in 4 years.
This is a fly fishing podcast, but for all you youngsters that are going to college, this is actually a really good way to do it.
Yeah, if you're thinking you need to go to college, which I think nowadays is not as big a deal.
Your mom goes to college.
Joe's way is the way. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So you go from English lit and high jumpy stuff to becoming a pretty well-known rod designer. How does that happen?
The initial foray into the fly fishing community there was my girlfriend and future wife at the time, future ex-wife at the time, was a year ahead of me at Geneseo. She went to Cornell and was going to get her PhD in paleontology at Cornell. And so she moved to Ithaca. I did my last year, and then I moved in together with her in Ithaca, and Ithaca is about a half hour from Courtland. So one of the first things I did, I got out of college, I moved in with Mary there, and then I made this resume with a picture of me with a fish. It was like a chest-pounding resume, and I sent it to Courtland.
Yeah.
And the president of the company at the time needed a customer service person.
Yeah.
So I pumped myself up where I was like, I've got awesome skill set, awesome at fishing. And so he reached out to me, and I was like, no way, is this that easy? And he was like, yeah, we have a job, but it was a customer service job.
Okay.
Which is, so ineffective. So I managed to get fired.
That's
after
how I'm going to start explaining my spreadsheet prowess. I'm very ineffective.
Right.
Okay.
So after a month of ineffective customer service stuff, where I kind of didn't deserve to get kicked out of there, but while I was there, I made fly line tapers and brought them to the president. I was like, I think I should have some business with creating a fly line taper, and he was like, that is not your job, and you can go back to customer service. Long story short, I left there. I was coaching track at Ithaca College, and then a position for product development opened up at Courtland. And Courtland reached out back to me and said, perhaps customer service wasn't your thing, but the type of stuff that you appear to be interested in is more of what we need now. And I went back to Courtland a second time, and then pretty quickly took over being the product manager of, first they were trying to do Climax was a brand Courtland was trying to reestablish, they made me the brand manager of that, and that was a small project. And then I started doing fly line stuff, and then I took over the products there. So I oversaw the fly line production room.
Cool.
And then I also did the product development, where their goal was to have a clear floating line.
Oh yeah, I remember.
For freshwater.
For freshwater.
And they had, before I got there, they had created a really stiff, clear, floating polyethylene saltwater line. It wasn't supple enough to really use. And he said, okay, we have the saltwater line, we need the freshwater line. And I spent like 2 years doing material research on polymers and plastics, trying to create a blend of a polyethylene blend of something that would be clear and would float. And after all of this work, I got to a point where I said, if you want it to be supple enough to cast, the specific gravity of it is going to be right around that of water, where in freshwater the thing's going to hover, and in saltwater it'll float. And you've got a much better saltwater line, and you really don't have a freshwater floating line. And to add the things necessary to make the gravity light enough, you would lose the clarity.
Yeah.
So those were all things I did at Courtland Line. At Courtland Line, I also wrote out the fly line standard for Phipps Moosh International of what defines a fly line.
Wow.
Of what diameter is the smallest diameter where something is still truly a fly line.
Very similar to English literature, right? Technical writing, same thing.
And in college, it was mostly Shakespeare. It was like my focus.
How would
Thou
Shakespeare
doeth use this line, which is a line by definition, dearest good man.
Oh, I don't even have a Shakespeare impersonation on that one. Sorry, guys.
It's a good thing I was here.
Yeah, Curtis is here.
Thou shalt
Nerds.
not fish with lines smaller than 22 thousandths. In competition,
Yeah.
There you
or
go.
thou shalt be expelled.
Thou shalt tell
Unless
us
you're
the
really
rules
good.
on the freaking podcast too. No, that's interesting. Like, we went and just did a tour at Rio, and I saw with my own two beady little eyes how fly lines are made, and my mind was blown. Like, it's crazy. You have to be real nerdy to get into that. Like, very detail oriented.
The fly line is similar to rods. There's just a couple parameters that are very dynamic that you can change. With lines, it's what the core is, what the diameter is, what the stiffness of the core is, what the bonding agent between the core and then the outside jacket or coating is, and then what that is and how stiff that is. And then potentially you could also coat on top of that.
Yeah,
So-
it's crazy.
And with a fly rod, the only three things are the internal expansion rate, the stiffness of the material, and the amount of that material that's built up on that taper rate. Those are the only three
Just those
moving
three things.
variables.
No big deal, right?
Well, it's to me, it really isn't a whole bunch of variables. It's how effectively can you manipulate those variables, and there's limitless possibilities to that.
So it's like Mexican food, right? You take some beans, some cheese, and a tortilla, and you can make 100 dishes with that, right?
Just ask Taco Bell.
Just ask. Oh, yeah. No, that's awesome. So, you're obviously, you're a great rod designer. When did you get into the rod design element? Like, how does one do this? And we've talked to a lot of rod designers, and nobody has I was doing this and this and this, and then all of a sudden
I got bit by a spider.
yeah. So, the guys, they're all crazy. They're all mad scientists, but you're definitely the maddest of them. That's a compliment, by the way. So how do you get into that?
Well, at Courtland Line, there were a couple things that I did before I left Courtland Line that were rod design focused, but not on a manufacturing floor. They were what I would call remote design, where somewhere else there's an engineer who's doing the actual patterns and tapers, and I was saying, okay, I want to, this nymph rod, I want the butt section to feel like it's 2 line weights heavier than what the tip section is. Yeah. I remember that was one of the design cues when I did the first Courtland Nymph rods. I did those, and then Courtland owned Diamondback brand, and I did a 2-handed rod series, the Diamondback Swinger. Both of those I designed remotely, like I just said, and then that was right close to the time that I left TNT. TNT had new investors, and there were a lot of things changing, or not TNT, Courtland. There's a lot of things changing at Courtland at the time that I was leaving there, with new ownership coming in and different managers. And also they weren't making payroll. Actually, when I left Courtland, they said, we're going to furlough you or something. And I said,
if you're designing a job, that's like the one parameter that you would want to hit.
How do you guys feel about paying payroll? Yeah.
So that was when Courtland stopped paying me, when they were in this kind of bottomed out mode. Randy Swisher, the sales manager, and I, right at the same time, they were like, we can't really pay you guys right now. And we both said, we're going to move on then.
Fair enough. That's my parameter.
Yeah, and Courtland's done a good job of kind of reinventing themselves with some of the Euro nymphing stuff. They've got some good tippets now. So yeah, but Courtland's kind of been like this over the years, as far
the
as
period where there was a bunch of different investors, all with some money involved and all trying to make some of the decisions, was when it was chaotic.
Yeah.
After I left, one main investor became the sole, operator for there, and then there weren't as many cooks in the kitchen as far as the management went, and it was, at the time that I was there, I could tell that there were different people who had little stakes who were saying, this guy should be doing that, and this guy should be doing that, and the president at the time wasn't a fishing person,
okay.
So it made it very hard to see through the smog of.
Yeah.
Who's.
You want to make $1,000 fishing pole? No, nobody's going to buy that, right? So you left there, and then I think where a lot of people really started to know your name and your designs was when with the Contact 2, right? But you've had your hands in a lot of other rods, right?
I did about 75 rods at TNT in over a 5-year period. So I was averaging about 15 rods, completed designs per year when I was designing there at TNT. And at Courtland, I was also managing the sales reps with kind of how they got the product and talking to them about how they were going to sell the product. And TNT hired me to be the sales manager. They did not hire me to design anything and didn't intend for me to be designing anything.
Okay.
Tom Dorsey was still there, and that wasn't their plan. But similar to me bringing a taper up to the president at Courtland, I wanted a nymph rod. And with what TNT was selling at the time, which was not very much, and it was very much classic type stuff, I didn't think that there was going to be a market for TNT to sell a specialty nymph rod. It'd be like Winston or Scott. Like TNT was in the situation where they had a pretty established, the deep flexing dry fly rods, classic saltwater rods, good spay rod.
Well, I would also say during that, let's say between the 90s when TNT was kind of at a pinnacle in the industry, you'd hear him in the same conversation as Sage or Scott. Kind of went away almost, at least on the western side of the country. From what I've seen.
Well, so I'm going to bring Tom Dorsey up here, and I learned a lot from some directly from Tom, more from being able to see Tom's design work before me and the progression of what Tom did, going from the first carbon designs he did in 2-piece to creating higher performance things in 4-piece. And I felt like Tom Dorsey had kind of a sweet spot, the Horizon 4-piece rods. There were a few things.
That was my first ever high-end rod. It was a Horizon Series 905 that I built, and it was awesome.
2 or 4 piece?
It was a 4-piece. Wait, now I can't remember. It could have been a 2-piece, but I think it was 4.
So the Horizon rods, that's where Tom transitioned from making spigot ferrules to doing tip-over butt ferrules.
Yeah.
And so although Tom didn't intend to stop designing or for me to be stepping in to design, Tom was getting up in years. So, and Tom was also kind of set in his ways that were kind of peaked during that Horizon 2 period. So Tom had designed a number of things that kind of hadn't taken a step forward in thinning out the walls and making the rods lighter. And Tom designed by feel only.
Okay.
So I got to have times where Tom and I stood out on the casting pond and would cast a rod back and forth, and he would say, "What would you change about the rod?" I said, "Well, it feels like it's like the tip mid isn't supporting the loop shape." Maybe that's true, but in order for that to happen, the butt mid needs to be stiffer, not the tip mid. There were certain things, and I don't know if I agree now in retrospect with all of them, but I definitely had these periods with Tom Dorsey where Tom gave me his view of how to design and how to make changes based on feel and not based on shape.
Well, and I'll tell the story. Like, you and I were casting at the Confluence show, right? Where I was casting a rod and you were watching, and you said, "Okay, Cheech, there's a point about 40% down in this rod where your loop's collapsing." You said, "Strip 2 feet of line in and do that same cast and then release it." And I'm like, who looks at a cast that way and figures that out? So I did it, and it went. And you're like, "Yep." Right? Like, I've never seen someone break down a cast like that. So you telling this story about Tom, like, that's a skill, even though you may not agree now or something, you may do some things a little bit different, but he, teaching you the process of what to look for. That's pretty cool.
And where that's a real skill is it's breaking away from the shapes of the curve and relying on what it feels like when the rod recovers. Because for everyone that puts rods up along a deflection board and looks at what the shape of them is, for me, that's the most confusing thing in the industry, because with the right amount of weight, I could take a fiberglass rod and make it make the same shape as a carbon rod, or I could, in a number of different ways, achieve a certain shape without making a rod higher performance. And it's very confusing to me to see these, sets of lines. And for a while at TNT, I was doing this, and for the most part, it didn't have much to do with what made a rod come out casting good. Spending the time on the water with leaders, with flies, in the wind, in the conditions where you pull the fly out of the water, where you set the hook on fish, where everything that you do with the rod, where you have to, lean the rod back behind your head to land the fish, all of those things, understanding how the rods respond to those in a dynamic, real-time action setting, and not just an static, with a 3-ounce weight hanging off the end of it. For me, that tells you so little. It's good to compare two things if you know that the constructions of them are identical.
Yeah.
But if you don't know what the construction internally is, you can be comparing two things that are very different, that have potentially an identical shape with the same amount of weight coming off of them.
Yeah. And I'll fast forward to now. So now you're with Diamondback, right? These are arguably the best Euro rods on the market, in my opinion, because there's been a lot of work into it. And I'll take it back. I think it was 2 years ago. You were in town, and you pull this black monstrosity out of a little car, like you had a rental car or something, or I don't know, you might have been driving. And you're like, "Cheech, I want to show you this rod." You said it's a 10-foot, 10-inch 2-weight. And I'm like, this is going to be a noodly sucker. And I'm like, "How's the recovery?" He's like, "Here, take it. So we were in the parking lot, and I just flexed it once, and it goes right back. And I'm like, okay, we're in. You say the word, we'll order this rod. But that's what kind of explained to me, like, okay, Joe's onto something. He understands rods. If he can get a 10-foot, a dang near 11-foot 2-weight, not to just shake your arm off when you flex it, we're in for something cool. And then this rod came out. The cool thing about that is everyone was asking us, well, what do you think about this? I'm like, oh yeah, I actually wiggled one. You did? So it was all the rage, so that was really cool. Oh my goodness. This isn't my wife calling, so I won't pick it up in the podcast.
I want to quickly hit on, the designing the rods at TNT. So initially I was the sales manager, and I wanted a Nymph rod for me.
Yeah, okay.
And so at the end of the day, when everyone left the production floor, I worked out on paper what I thought I needed to know in order to create parts that were going to fit together. And then I went out and I cut the carbon myself, and no one had given me the go-ahead. And Tom Dorsey didn't know that I was doing design stuff. And
design dungeon.
I kept having, and the production floor was very skeptical about what I was doing. So I was trying to get the people who were rolling the parts to roll the parts that I had cut, which is never a skill that I've developed very well. The rolling the patterns onto the mandrels is a very finessey, touch-based thing. I can do it. You have to get the stuff.
But they were doing
it
by hand, not by machine with the little press.
It's both.
Oh, okay. To get them started.
Yeah. Almost everyone who does it in the industry, there's handwork and machine work that both happen in order to make a really good part. But so I ended up having these parts and going to the wrappers at TNT also, who were like, why are we doing this for you? And I was, can you, I've got these guides. I want to. So there was the 10-foot 8-inch original contact 4-weight was the first blank that I made, and I do a lot of heavier nymphing stuff. That was something that was made for me. Made completely designed around feel, and I had no idea what the durability would be with these high modulus parts that I was cutting, and I made this blank, and I was like, man, this feels awesome. And I remember at one point, I didn't know how thick the walls needed to be, just, the butt section. I remember Neville, the owner of, the president of TNT, came in and had the rod. I had a blank on my desk, and he broke it in his hands. He broke the butt section, and it wasn't designed. It was a defective design because you could do that.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't do that on a fish, but it probably would eventually, fail. And learning about durability was the biggest hill to climb to design rods.
Well, especially with a really, really thin, lower weight rod. Like that's insane to me.
That's the last type of thing that you're going to design in a durable way. The long, thin-walled rods that people are going to Euro nymph with or whipping around weighted things, and you've got that long, lightweight rod that they're, trying to land the fish with a 10-foot, 10-inch 2-weight. That rod is going to be hooked around into a horrible shape when you're netting a nice, heavy fish and trying to hold that fish on 6X, tippet and current with that rod. And so those original rods I made broke all the time. The original contact rods, they felt very good, but I didn't know how durable they would be, and I didn't think anyone was going to want them because it was TNT. And then suddenly they felt good. People wanted them. They're breaking them left and right. And I was in a situation where we weren't making any money on the rod. It was breaking so often. The butt sections were breaking, so you'd lose the price of the cork, and people were having frustrating situations. But it was obvious that the market was viable there, and the Nymph rods drove me, just like with those working on the polymers to create the lines at Courtland. The Nymph rod made me understand the material science. Mm-hmm. So I was doing breaking tests and breaking things in bends and making my own statistics about what what wall thicknesses and what reinforcement fibers and what classes of carbon, what tonnage or modulus levels of carbon were having the best. I wasn't doing tensile crushes. I created this test where I was bending the part and breaking it, where I was insulating, the things that were touching it, and that was a different type of statistic than just crushing the side of a tube. Or so I came up with my own perception of, or concept, I should say, of what material strategy, reinforcement fibers, internal diameters, wall thicknesses it would take to achieve the best durability.
Sure, yeah.
And then I approached designing the Contact 2 rods, trying to create something not better in action than the original Contact rods. I just tried to create something as good as those rods, designed in like a smart, durable, bulletproof way. And that is so much harder to do than to design a rod that just feels good.
Yeah.
There's lots of rods across the world where I hear people say, well, rod X, something, rod feels good, has a high break rate, it's back in the shop right now. So for me,
vice versa on the other side. Like I was at a show once and the guy's like, you cast this rod, you won't believe it. And I cast, I'm like, this is terrible. He's like, oh yeah, but look at this fish that I landed with it. I'm like, okay, well, sure, maybe it's really strong in the butt, but like you still have to cast this thing. So, a lot of companies like, oh, this is the strongest rod ever, you'll never break it. And others are just pure casting. So I can see that, it's you have to have both of those. Durability, got to feel good. Right?
And
check
so,
1 and 2.
But getting that sort of understanding of the material strategy to create things that are long and thin-walled and recover fast and feel sensitive but don't break very often on the water, for me, that is the absolute hardest design challenge going. And also create those specialty actions, because when you start making rods in weird lengths and you're trying to chase a trend of something like people are using lighter and lighter leaders, smaller and smaller flies, the fish aren't getting smaller, the equipment needs to try to catch up with what the strategy of the anglers is doing. And so that's on top of just the rods being long and light and trying to make them durable, trying to understand the market from a tactical standpoint and meeting the demands of that is another variable that, for me, if you can design a durable, high-performance nymph rod in a weird length like 10'8" or 10'9" or 10'10", and I also did that to kind of flex my design ability to show that I was designing things in lengths that other people weren't already doing.
For sure.
Making new actions in new lengths. That's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
So, and if you can do that, you can make a saltwater rod that's less likely to break than the competitor saltwater rod.
Sure. Yeah.
And also the guide placement, where the reinforcement fibers, there's a lot of things that are unseen that contribute to a product not failing when you do real stuff with it.
And so I just wanted to stop and look at this conversation from 10,000 foot view. Look at your rod company, and do you know who's designing that rod, and are they fishing the rod, and are they passionate about it? Because we know quite a few of the rod designers, and they're all crazy like that. However, I've also had a lot of kind of off-brand 10-footers that people have brought in, because like 10-foot 3-weight's all the rage right now. But a lot of companies are just tacking on another 12 inches to the butt of something else. And you wiggle those, and it's just like, whoa, like this is really, really bad.
Well, and what you also have, and I think this is a big distinction, like Sean Combs we had on our last podcast, and we've talked to some of the other rod designers that we know. They're U.S. made, not remotely designed, but then you've got a whole slew of rods that are remotely designed, and it's kind of an iterative process that maybe, at what point does whoever's remotely designing these rods overseas say, that's good, and not take it to the point where you're slicing and dicing all these parameters and you're testing and you're invested and you control the process enough to be able to go back or to be able to go and say, that broke, now we're going to go back to the drawing board in some sense. I don't know that happen so much on the full remote thing if we're talking overseas design, which is, again, for the rod designers that we know with those companies that are, I would say very legit, that's the common thread. You're fishing it, you're designing it, you're testing the inputs, and you're going through that process, which to me has to be the way to do it.
And it has to be a passion project too. Like, this doesn't just happen if it's the job that you hate and you go home and try to get away from your work. Like, this is something that you probably just eat and breathe a rod when you're in the middle of it. It's like when I'm thinking of a fly, it's like I'm so focused on that, I just have to get it right. I can see the passion. Like, we did a little casting game out there, and you kicked my butt in every single category. So like you see it, the passion's there, the skill's there, But like, this is the dude that's designing your Euro rods, sitting right here. You can't say that about a lot of others,
The passion is at 5:45. I was up this morning because I drove down here to fish for 2 hours before I came in here to do the event. And the fishing I did this morning, I challenged myself to go and fish for some of the fish in very accessible places that I know the good anglers around here are pounding those fish. And yesterday I did some fishing that was a little bit easier. This morning I did fishing just to keep myself on pace with how hard the heavily fished fish in the easily accessible areas are here, how small the flies need to be, how light the leaders are, how fast the fish are eating. And it helps me understand where the market is going.
Yeah.
And it also, this morning I was having product ideas.
Sure.
That there's some stuff that I can't quite really reveal what's going on yet, but it's hard for me to stop, product development.
And that's how you have the right job.
But you also do this with flies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like, that's where we're kin here. Like, Joe comes to me, shows me a fly, and explains what's going on, and like, everything has a purpose, which is like I'm an engineer by background, so I groove on that. I love the function, the nerdly functional analysis of stuff. Like, why, and taking a fly and tweaking it and going back and figuring out, why do I have this and what does this do? I love that. But I think that's the best way you get good products in our industry, is that you've got people that are passionate, that have at least some ability to design and look at things objectively, to say, yeah, that's not going to work, as opposed to just throwing something on the wall and see what sticks. That's not going to. There are those, but
my level of commitment to the flies is, you can go out and search online and see podcasts of me talking about nothing but musky fly construction, the balance points, the irregular action, the rigging strategies, for an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Joe and I were having this conversation downstairs behind the counter, and there was a guy at the register. He's just like what? So yeah, I think it's really cool just that, I've gotten to know you over the last 7 or 8 years as we've just kind of seen each other at shows and everything, but watching your progression, you see a lot of people that will start like a podcast or a blog, or our podcast is a bad example because we're so bad at it, but
we're getting better though.
The fire just to continue on with the one sport is awesome. Like, it resonates with me because I'm very what's the word?
You're a serial hobbyist.
I'm a serial hobbyist. Yeah. So I like, I'll get into like driving remote control cars or airplanes or something like that, and then the next week I'm building something. But fly fishing is always there. Oh yeah, let's see.
Speaking of the devil, every time I think I've seen Joe, he's come up and said, "Hey, look at this fly," and immediately goes into the design and the materials and the function, which I love. Yeah. Because it's very well thought out.
Well, the last time he came in the shop, this is that time when he came in with the other rod. He's like, "Cheech, I've been fishing the lower Provo, and I think my flies are a little too big." And I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna get you a few that are a little bit more Western friendly." But yeah, tell us what we have here.
Talking about what goes into the rod design, and for me, just as much goes into the fly design And so I've got a couple jointed jig flies. These are all flies I was just fishing for salter brook trout up in Hudson Bay about a month ago with my friend Lance Will. But having flies that have a 3/8 ounce jig head, but then enough spun deer hair to balance out the sink rate of that fly, where you have a heavy vibration profile without having so fast of a sink rate that it makes the fly hard to manage and keep off the bottom. So, those flies that have the big weighted heads and the spun deer hair just create this presence in the water that when you have a fish that's struggling, like a bait fish that's struggling, the volume of that bait fish it's a solid thing. And when we create flies, we're often times trying to create flies that are easy to cast and fly through the air easily. But, what would feel like the real minnow to the fish would be like if we were casting an actual minnow around. Yeah. And it's something that has that density and weight and mass and hydrophobicity as it moves through the water. So having something like this is a way of creating that feeling for the fish where something is pushing and vibrating and the water is really being displaced like a hard, solid bodied hydrophobic fish, but you have, that deer hair is still open and hollow and you can cast that through the air without having the mass of it. So
trout slider. That's the same idea. Heavyweight deer hair, and it creates such movement.
Very important that it doesn't just sink immediately, because then that defeats the purpose of that.
They'll eat it on the fall a lot.
And then these these mouse or rodent flies that I came up with right before this trip to Hudson Bay have a whole pile of polypropylene yarn, which floats. Has hydrophobic properties where it doesn't absorb water, but by using so much of it and trimming it to shape where it's kind of cream on the bottom and brown on the back, you have something that in the water has a massive presence similar to what an actual mouse would do pushing around the water. But when you pull that out of the water drains off the polypropylene and you can cast that easily, and it fills up with water like a sponge, pushing the water around as it moves through the water. And this fly has a tail that is 2 strands of dun-colored polypropylene yarn covered in shoe goop. And
that's just
what that acts as, you have the polypropylene yarn floats, making it solid with the shoe goop makes it's still flexible, but it's absolutely durable. This is a fly that I probably caught 100 fish on already, and it acts as a floating rudder on the back of the mouse fly. So as that's coming through the water, that floating semi-rigid tail out the back keeps that fly very stable and really contributes to it looking like something that's a real
for sure.
food item. And I see a lot of the different tails that are used on the mouse flies or rodent flies, and in reality that's the thing that's right in the fish's face before that fish potentially eats or decides not to eat that fly. And having something that has that actual round amount of mass tracking through the current as opposed to a piece of silicone tubing or strip of rabbit strip.
People need to watch
nothing like a tail of an actual
They need to see what a mouse really looks like when it swims.
It's heavy.
Because it doesn't go like this.
Just
it
the
just
head
kind of goes
like
that. Yeah, absolutely. And, this is another thing that, knowing a whole bunch of fly patterns is cool, but knowing the properties of materials and how they're going to move in the water, like the more you understand the materials of fly tying, the more you can create and make like really effective trout flies, as opposed to just throwing a bunch of stuff on a hook, But yeah,
my crayfish fly, I see all kinds of crayfish flies tied where they have a weight at the back, and the way big trout that actually are feeding on crayfish on a regular basis, they feed on them. It's a vibration profile thing where the trout will move slowly through these rocky substrates. Usually it's knee to thigh deep water that's not moving very fast, and that's where the young crayfish live. And the young crayfish, they're not very smart. They spook at the presence of things. And the trout will just go along, and as the crayfish spook, they swim backwards. They can't see where they're going. They swim backwards until they bump into something. And if you watch trout or carp that are feeding on crayfish, you'll see them moseying along, and you'll see them feel something that they don't see and then move over in a direction and look for it. And when I was designing the crayfish flies, I was trying to find a way to create a fly that would create this bumping profile in the water where, as you were fishing it, it would thump against the rocks or the bottom and make a similar bump that the fish, usually feel right before they eat a crayfish. They see it either swim backwards and bump into something or go and hit the bottom. And so when I was wrapping the rubber around the back end of that jig ball, it wasn't just a visual thing of creating the shape of a crayfish tail. It was all about having that rubber bumper in the back. So as that fly is tracking through the water, as it bumps along the bottom, every time it does that, it creates this vibration profile that fish that are looking for that feel with their lateral line.
And it's probably not like the ticking that a bear bead would give too.
The metal things are going to create such a different, sound to the fish when they're hitting the bottom
versus a covered plastic.
Yeah, I see companies making like a metal tungsten crayfish tail shaped tail.
Yeah.
It's just going to smash along the bottom and create, a presence that's not going to feel like the actual bug to the fish. And I feel like oftentimes we're so visually oriented
so
we lose track of those other elements, the mass, the gravity.
If you're listening to this, what's the fly called? It's a fulling mill
Joe's mini crayfish.
Joe's mini crayfish. Yeah.
We sell a lot of those flies, and
you can Euro nymph with it. You can strip it. Like it's a great little pattern.
So many people have sent me pictures of the biggest brown trout they've ever caught and said, "I just want you to know, I just caught my personal best brown trout on the crayfish fly."
See, I get pictures like, "Cheech, your flies suck. They never work." Anyway, what else, Joe? We probably need to have you come on more, but
I wanted to hit on this.
Yeah.
So I have this ideal nymph 10-foot 2 weight here in front of me, but there's a certain concept going on these rods that no one else is doing that I want to highlight, and that's having 2 stripping guides. And for everybody who's using the nymph rods, a really common issue is the line sticking to the rod. Mm-hmm. Lots of people are wrapping mono or doing certain things to try to alleviate that line stick to the rod. The thinner the leader you use, the more of a problem it is. And most of the rods are built using just one stripping guide that oftentimes is like a low profile stripping guide. And this is something, while I was at TNT, I didn't understand this concept yet, and I looked for the most low profile stripping guide that I could have, because I thought I wanted the line closest to the blank.
Yeah.
However, I've realized now that by having a stripping guide down here, there's 2 advantages you get by having a second stripping guide instead of going from a stripping guide right to a single foot guide. One of the biggest advantages is the line stick issue that you think of the difference when you have the line coming out of your hand and going over 2 stripping guides that have a bit of a foot before getting to a single foot. When your line is under tension, support the line a little bit up off of the blank all the way across the area from where the first single foot guide starts to your hand.
So like all the way from here to your hand, it's off the rod for sure.
So there's about another 30-40% of the rod versus whether you have a low profile single first stripping guide going right to single foots where the line can right away lay flat along the blank and stick. Mm-hmm. But with this setup, your line can't start sticking until up here, because these aren't low profile. They have about 3/8 of an inch of separation to keep your line up off the blank. So,
and you're saving the weight of having a double stripping guide by just doing a single foot stripping guide too, right?
There's so many great components. It's just like hooks.
Yeah.
The number of hooks we have available to us in the last few years, the number of guide shapes that we have available to us in the last few years. We've got better options than we had before. Mm-hmm. And so the other advantage of having a second stripping guide up here on the rod is when you have these long, light rods. This is a 10-foot 2 weight. when you are fighting a big fish with a rod like this, that rod is bent over pretty good, and you have those rods flexed in the butt mid of the rod. And whichever guide on the rod is closest to the apex of the bend when you're fighting the fish, that guide is absorbing the highest, it has the sharpest angle, and it's absorbing the highest amount of friction. And so oftentimes when you're fighting a big fish and you have that rod bent, the lower part of the rod going down to the butt mid is where the apex of that bend is. So if you have a big fish pulling line off of your reel under tension on a nymph rod, having a second stripping guide allows the point that the line is folded along when you're fighting a big fish and the rod is really bent to be going over a ceramic insert, as opposed to forcing it to, fold sharp around a metal single foot.
There are like 50 things that you would never think of that you thought of. We can't even go into the reel. Like the reel, when you showed me that reel, I'm like, holy crap. But to have you explain the reel, I mean, it just shows that like every tiny little detail has been gone over and tested. Like how would you ever know that unless you really fished it and really pushed it hard?
That's the thing about durability, is if a rod doesn't break for someone, you don't know how durable it is. But the rods that over time have that history of all of the models not breaking regularly,
absolutely,
that shows where the durability is in a product.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you've done a spectacular job with Diamondback. I would say now is probably our top selling brand of Euro nymphing rod.
Wow.
The reels have done great. We all use them. I mean, just again, you're heading in the right direction, and we're super stoked to see other stuff that will inevitably come out in the future.
The story I always tell about this is, you have these turkeys that go and do this competition angling. We all know them, old Lance Egan that sits here sometimes. A lot of those guys decided to take a Diamondback with them to Worlds over their $1,000 rods. So that's what I tell them, like, hey, this is the rod that a lot of these guys are fishing. So does that tell you anything? Because like they're fishing for the highest stakes fishing in their life, and this is the tool they chose. They're like, whoa.
When Lance reached out to me last season before Worlds and said, I want to buy 2 10-foot 2 weights. I want to make sure I have the rod and I have a backup version of it for the championships. That was one of the highest compliment type things. The people that I respect the most, when they choose to use the things I designed, for me, that's more important than sending it to fly fishermen, having the editor say, "Oh, we're going to give you, a little star award, because you paid for plenty of advertising for us, so we're going to do that for you." It's like, all right, is that the pat on the back I'm looking for? But when someone like Lance Egan, who I've always put on a pedestal as being just the cream of the crop type trout fisherman in the country, chooses to use stuff that I've designed like that, and working here where he has access to seeing everything, that is a high compliment for me, that at the end of the day, I feel good about those.
Yeah, absolutely.
So good. Well, I think we're
49 minutes.
Man, we've really...
That's what I'm saying. We got to have you come back. We'll talk about flies and reels.
We need to come back in the summer, spring, where we can go out and spend a couple days and do some R&D and then podcast it up. That's what we're doing.
All right. We don't need these fly fishing conferences to get us together. Anyway, Joe Goodspeed,
Diamondback
Rods.
We've got the rods and the reels on our website. You can find them at your local shop if you're lucky.
So now, when you're fishing this rod, if you listen to this, you're going to be able to maybe understand what you have in your hands.
Thanks, Joe.
Curtis, Cheech, thank you guys. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff in front of the audience that you guys have. That's a great opportunity.
Yeah,
cool.
You bet.
All right. Thanks, Joe.